Hi folks, it has taken me a little bit longer than I had anticipated to get this video done. I had hoped to have it out last week, but unfortunately life got in the way and I wasn't able to do that, so apologies. So this week's video here on Takumi Medaka is going to be discussing the challenge of overwintering Medaka. But my wife here, I just wanted to share this, she's quite the artist, and this is a metal riff that she's working on. It's not finished yet, but it's really cool to see that coming along, so I'm excited to see what that looks like. So let's talk about, can you overwinter Medaka? And when people talk about rice fish, one of the things they talk about is the fact that they really are a very tough and resilient fish. But they have limitations, like any fish, and you have to be really conscious of how and when and where to prepare and actually overwinter the fish, because if you do it the wrong way, you are going to run into some problems. So let's talk about overwintering Medaka. And the question is, can you? And the answer is, well, you can, but it depends. They are a very tough, resilient fish, more so than, guppies. But like any fish, there are a lot of variables. You can't just dump them from one kind of water to another and expect them, without acclimation, to just bounce back. So they are versatile, but they are not a bulletproof fish. And living in Texas, where we get sometimes 4 seasons in one day, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that as a fish, as a living creature and an organism, it actually thrives not off of constant comfort, but off of 4 seasons. And that 4-season rhythm allows them to have a greater productivity of eggs, but also a longer life. I heard this described by another breeder as kind of like a little engine that you can run at full speed all the time, and eventually that engine is just going to break if you don't give it a chance to slow down and rest. And that's what these 4 seasons actually represent for the Medaka. They need the summer, they need the heat, they need the sun to thrive and to show all their best colors, but they also need autumn and winter and spring. So just leaving them in a heated tank and having them indoors, anyone who's tried to raise Medaka for any length of time indoors will tell you that they just don't get the same success and productivity that they do outside. So just with our own lives, where constant comfort is not good for us and breeds weakness, it's the same with our Medaka. If we just keep them in heated tanks constantly year round, they are going to be a weaker fish, and they're going to die a lot sooner, and they're going to have much lower levels of production. So let's talk about what happens to them in the cold. We'll leave summer for a different season, but in the cold, there's this mythology that they hibernate, but they don't actually hibernate. They slow their metabolic rate down. Their metabolism slows right down, their heart rate slows, their organs slow down, and sometimes what you'll see them do is go to the very bottom of the tank, or the tub, or the tote, or whatever you're running them in outside. I have HDX totes that I bought from Home Depot, and that's where I run mine. And when it gets cold, you'll see them gathering down towards the bottom, where it tends to be warmer. And you'll see very little movement. And you'll see, if anything, just their fins just kind of slowly moving just to steady them. But they're in a state of very slow metabolism. And I'll tell you shortly why, when they're in that state, the best thing to do is largely just leave them alone. Okay, so where you are matters. I'm from Australia originally, and my home state is Queensland. But I couldn't treat my Medaka in Queensland the same way I would in Japan. Japan obviously has 4 very clear seasons. Queensland doesn't. It has a winter, but it's nothing like it is in Japan. It has very hot summer, a warm spring, and the fall is cooler, or the autumn as they would call it. But you can't treat your Medaka the same way in Queensland that you would in Japan. You can't treat them the same way in Washington as you would in Texas. So you have to be aware of what your actual conditions are, and you have to read the weather, not the seasons. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm in Dallas, Texas.
Yeehaw!
And it's the fall. But today it was 78 degrees, which is as warm as I would expect on a spring day. And tomorrow we're going to have a cold front where that temperature is going to swing almost 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a huge swing. So I just can't treat the fish the same way here in Texas that I would in Washington, where the seasons, certainly the winter, is a little bit more predictable. So because I have these huge swings here in Texas, I'm not going to treat them the same way that I would in Montana. Now, in Montana, it's going to be cold, and it's going to be cold for an extended period of time. And so it's very likely that a 27-gallon tote in Montana during the winter is not going to be a healthy way to overwinter those fish, because it's going to freeze solid. And yes, they can survive under ice, but if the water itself freezes, they're going to die. Okay? So it's not feasible to overwinter your fish in an environment like that, in which case you do need to bring them indoors. But when you bring them indoors, you don't have to put heaters in their tubs or totes or whatever you do with them, but you should bring them indoors so that they're not having to endure the ice, which they just won't survive. So this Tuesday, I've got a 30-degree swing from a low of 41 to a high of 71. Today is November the 8th, 2025. And then again on Wednesday, we've got this swing from 54 to 75. So just really significant swings, which can put a lot of stress and pressure on the fish themselves. What kills the fish is going to be ice, not the cold. But if you intervene in a way that's unhelpful, you can also put undue stress on the fish themselves. So let's talk about feeding patterns. Winter prep begins in the fall. In the same way that it's hard to go from having 3 square meals a day to no meals, the fall is a really good opportunity for you to break your feeding pattern so the fish get used to eating less frequently and smaller amounts. Unlike a lot of other fish, like koi for example, Medaka do not have a stomach. It takes about 2 hours for them to digest their food, 90 minutes to 2 hours. So you need to feed them when you know that there's going to be a window where the water will be warm enough for them to properly digest the food and not causing indigestion. So one of the things I rely on very heavily is an infrared thermometer. Flashing a picture of that up now. And that allows me to really stay on top of my totes, to understand what the temperatures are doing, because they're exposed to different amounts of sun, and so those temperatures are varying quite a bit. I don't feed under 55 Fahrenheit. 65 and above, I'm still happy to feed. I'm not feeding ginormous amounts, but at this time of the year, 65 and above, I'm very happy to feed those fish. Under 65, I will feed, but I feed smaller amounts. And I make sure that when I look at my weather app, I know I've got a 2-hour window so that the feed has enough time to go through the fish's digestive system and to be processed and not cause indigestion. Now, the problem with overfeeding here is that, one, if you overfeed and you don't have a window where the temperature is going to be high enough for the fish to actually process the food, that's going to cause digestive problems. So, I'm not going to feed late at night when I know, even if the water temperature is above 55, that within the next 2 hours it's going to drop pretty suddenly, because that's going to cause digestive issues. Equally, if I feed too much and it's too cold, then you run the risk of fouling your water because the fish may not be hungry enough. And that food will then rot and cause an ammonia spike. Now, this is where it comes back to reading your temperatures and your tank or totes or whatever you have, and the activity level of the fish. If your fish are at the top of the water, if they're active, if they're energetically swimming around, that tells you that they're probably in a decent condition to feed. Because every strain, every group is going to be a little bit different. And it's no different with my setup. I have Kirameki, I have Yuki Longfins, I have Yozakura Golds, but I have a house line that I got from a friend of mine that are called Taiwan Tigers, and they're a little bit more sensitive than some of the others. So you got to read the temperature as opposed to just following blindly the season, and you also have to read your specific tank, tote, tub, whatever you're keeping your fish in, and see what that level of activity is. If they're all sitting towards the bottom, that's probably telling you that water is getting to a temperature where they're starting to slow down. So as I said, you don't want to overfeed because it will impact digestion and the quality of the water. Alright, so what do we do with our fish during the winter when it really hits? Well, the best thing we can do is we need to figure out when to observe and when to ignore. And the reason I say that is because when they are in that state of a slowed down heart rate and metabolism, even something as a moving shadow can scare them. And so when they move, when their metabolic rate is so low, it can cause them to expend a lot of energy, precious energy, and cause them a lot of stress. Well, what do we do with water changes? Well, during this winter period, we're not going to be feeding them massive amounts of food, if at all. And so they're not producing waste, you're not putting food in the tote or the tub, causing an ammonia spike. So generally speaking, you don't really need to change water at all. And when it's very cold, certainly below 50, but even at 55 on exercise caution, because they're starting to slow down, I'm just trying to minimize the amount of stress, fear, and anxiety that I'm giving the fish by even something as simple as lifting a lid or casting a shadow over the tote. What do I do in the case of ice? And should I have air? I run sponge filters in my totes, in part because I have the capacity to do that. I know a lot of breeders in Japan, for example, just run simple air lines that bubble and agitate the surface of the water. That obviously works, but for my own reasons, because I tend to have I like to feed heavy when the weather is good, because I use my totes to reproduce and breed at scale and line breed, and because I have access to it, I run sponge filters. There is no necessity in that, but certainly having some surface agitation will reduce the risk of ice. But they can survive under a layer of ice. But remember that the depth of the tote or the tub will have a significant impact on that. If it's too shallow, like I see a lot of Japanese breeders use very shallow totes, which is fine when they're breeding, but when it's cold, those very shallow totes or tubs are going to freeze solid a lot quicker than a deeper tote, like a 27 gallon. So if you see some ice forming, that's not a cause for panic. But if you do start to have concern about the actual water volume freezing, that's when you're in an environment when you really need to bring them indoors. Again, not necessarily into a tank that's heated, but simply maybe putting them in a garage so that they're still experiencing the ups and downs of the season without running the risk of being frozen solid. Air. I've done a little bit of research on this, and there is this thing called supercooling that I understand can be caused by too much air volume passing through the water. I don't pretend to understand that, but I think that the level of air that you're pushing through a sponge filter is unlikely to really cause any significant issues. The other thing is, you are going to probably lose some fish. Some of that is going to have to do with the age and size of the fish. If you've got some younger fry in there, they simply may not make it. Part of the reason for having them outside, apart from their metabolism resting and slowing down so that when the spring kicks in, they're ready to breed, I also want to weed out the weaker fish. I don't want to breed the weaker fish. I want to make sure that they've got a strong, stable, steady line, and so overwintering is a way of maintaining strength in the line, but I will lose some fish, and that's okay. I don't anticipate significant losses this winter, because I've had my fish out year round, so they've developed some resilience to the heat swings that we have here in Texas. They've also become quite resilient in the sense that I don't currently run crushed coral in my totes, which is a very safe and manageable way to buffer your water, because when you get rain, you can cause, especially if it's significant amounts of rain, you can really get significant jumps in pH. I haven't done that, and those fish have been fine. And so I'm trying to bring a strong, stable line, and that's why I keep them outdoors and why I will let them go outdoors. So the rule here is not outdoors at all costs, and it's not every single person must bring all their fish in order for them to survive. My advice is, if you know that you're not going to get temperatures that are below freezing for consistent periods of time, that are not likely to actually freeze the tote solid, there is great value in overwintering your fish outdoors. But if you're in a climate where it's just going to freeze solid, then your fish will die, in which case you got to bring them indoors. Ideally not into heated tanks, but even just having them in their totes in garages where they'll experience some cold will hugely benefit your fish. So, if you've liked what I've had to say today, if it's been helpful in any way, please comment, like, share, and subscribe. And comment, like, what's your experience with overwintering Medaka? What's worked for me is not necessarily going to work for everybody. So let me know what's worked for you. And you can follow us here at Takumi Medaka on YouTube, or Takumi Medaka TX on Instagram. And I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.